Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video series. We take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. With this video, we'll be reviewing the adventure Rise of the Genie Lords Part 1, designed by Brian Hamilton for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my content, consider using my affiliate links for online shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/RogueWatson. This is a 5-part adventure series, but that is all available on the DM's Guild, but I'm only reviewing part 1 for the purposes of this review, and then you can hopefully extrapolate my review from there. I wish I could tell you what level this adventure is designed for, but in what may be a first for an adventure that I've reviewed, I couldn't find any information at all about the level that players are supposed to start, the level of which they're supposed to progress through. There's no adjustment for encounters or anything, and that's kind of an important piece of information. So I literally reread and reread and reread, and maybe it's hidden in here somewhere, but I literally couldn't find what level this is designed for, other than the fact that it's a 5-part series. So clearly we're probably starting at a fairly low level and then getting up to a fairly higher level, but unfortunately I am not, I don't know what to tell you. There's no information on level progression, and that's not my only problem with this adventure. And I don't want to start off with too negative, because I do think there are some very good things about it. First and foremost is the setting. Finally, we are ditching the Sword Coast in this adventure. If you can't tell by Rise of the Genie Lords, it's got a kind of desert Arabian Nights theme. Specifically takes place around the city of Calimport and the Calim Desert, which is far, far, far to the south. I had to pull up a world map, by the way, of the Forgotten Realms, because I'm pretty much, along with 5e, I've only know anything about the Sword Coast, and then, Chult and Icewind Dale, basically. And Calimport is all the way south along the coast, and then you kind of go east a little bit in to the Shining Sea, and there is this massive, massive huge city on the edge of the desert known as Calimport. And this, what I thought initially is maybe we've got a Prince of the Apocalypse situation with this rise of these 4 different genie lords, 2 of whom have waged war against each other for hundreds or thousands of years, whatever it's been, and then they've been sealed away once, and then the spell plague happened and they were broke out, and then they went to war, and then they've been sealed away again. And the story here is that, of course, there are some nefarious members of those factions who are trying to bring back their genie lords and wage war again for whatever horrible reason. And the party is initially hired duplicitously by one of the agents working for one of the genie lords, and to retrieve an artifact, literally a very much a MacGuffin that they've already got in possession of. And the party starts off in Luskan, and they travel to Calimport, and then from Calimport out to the Calim Desert in order to finally meet the person who was giving them the mission to transport this thing. That's all fine, and that's a decent adventure hook. The problem is there's nothing really to do for the players for that entire leg of the journey, which is a very long leg of the journey. You might as well, first of all, just start them in Calimport, because I guess you feel like everybody has to start in the Sword Coast because that's where everything happens. So we obviously have to bring the players from the Sword Coast, but I think you're also allowed to make characters, from Calimport and just have them be, in that area. But for example, in Luskan, for this encounter, it's an 8-week journey on the sea, and it's reduced to this D20 table of, generic naval water encounters, and then a bunch of saving for diseases. I don't know about you guys, and I know that every D&D group is different, but I don't play D&D so that I can make saves against scurvy. Because of my character's lack of, vitamin C deficiency while on the sea. That's not something I want to have to worry about. That's not exactly a compelling gameplay mechanic for me. Maybe that's just me, but the designer kind of goes hard with the disease saving, and there's another part where the travel does the same thing. You have to worry about diseases while traveling. So there's nothing really going on in the huge trip from Luskan to Calimport, and then in Calimport, this gets really problematic for me. There are pages and pages and pages, almost 10 pages dedicated to Calimport, which is a major location. It's a huge city in the Forgotten Realms. But this is an adventure book and not a source book. And my problem is you're providing all this information, but there's nothing for the players to really do here. It's like if they entered this giant, open world city and they could just wander around it, but they just kind of but there's no quests or anything to do. It's just there's some shopping, and then there's a lot of like lore and information. Some of it's kind of interesting. There's a ghost, and there's like streets that bleed, and there's all these little interesting things that I don't know if the designer came up with these or if they poured over older editions of information about the city. Whatever it is, it feels like there's a lot of information here that either should have been dedicated to a source book, or maybe you put all of this at the end of your adventure as like an appendix and say, hey, here's our Calimport gazetteer or whatever, but then give me the Cliff Notes version so I can at least run a compelling series of events for the party to do that. Maybe there's another, faction that's after this artifact and they chase the players through the streets, or the players can do, meet some interesting side quests and get some stuff here, like something, but there's nothing here. And it's so crazy that there's so much information dedicated to this city. And I'll be honest, my eyes were kind of glazing over by the third page because there's, it doesn't help that there's not a whole lot of art and there's very small text, and that's presentation wise is a bit of an issue. But the content is very disappointing for the city in terms of what is actually useful for the DM versus what is just like world and lore building. And maybe there are groups out there that really dig that kind of thing and they specifically play D&D for that, to hear the DM tell the story about the city. But I would be bored out of my ever-loving mind if this was the case in this city. There's just nothing to do here, which is a big bummer. You can collect rumors. They may have some, again, more lore information building, but it's not like in, if you want to do a good example of city rumors are the ones in Tomb of Annihilation, Port Nyanzaru, where those rumors all lead to like useful like quest events or to progress different quest chains. And here it's just, hey, here's some fun, more world building things and lore that the players can learn. So it's still not particularly that. I mean, some of it can be fun, but it's not actionable intel for the DM to give the players. And then we get to Calim Desert. Here's another problem where there's just not, it's a lack of content, which is odd because you think, okay, we've got this giant dangerous region for the players to explore in, and they need to find a certain location, so maybe we'll pop up with some other things to do. And that's really not the case. I mean, there's a little bit of information here, but you can tell a lot of it's kind of outside the skull. There's a Draco Lich lair, but otherwise there's only one area the players are really meant to go to. And unfortunately it does again the cardinal sin of just giving me a table of encounters. I really hoped we would kill with 5th edition. I think it's done a pretty good job of just killing this old school process of providing content in the form of just random ass monster rolls with no context or anything there. I hate that. And I really think that a lot of what 5e has done well is, they might do that table at the beginning, but then they will itemize each one and say, okay, so for the 1d4 beetle swarms, the players come across these, dead animals on the roadside, and then the beetles swarm out, and some information to provide, even if it's just a little bit of flavor text, or maybe in some cases it's, 2 of them put together, or there'll be a weather event to go along with it, or do, something. Give me little paragraphs to expand all these encounters, and don't just make it so that DM has to come up with, oh, you turn a corner and there's 44 jackals there, and we roll for initiative. Like, that's also just not very compelling for me as either a DM or a player. So unfortunately we get a lot of negativity so far. We finally get our one interesting faction here, and yes, there is some information earlier on about, hey, how do we use the official 5e factions, which I do appreciate that. I think they're very underused and underdeveloped, and have been underused and underdeveloped in 5e, even though they've been baked in since the beginning. A lot of designers kind of ignore them, so I do appreciate when you try to say, hey, here's how the players from these factions might try to be involved in this adventure, and then maybe there's even some extra character hooks for each of the players that could try to make them for a reason for going to Calimport, which I also do like, and I use something similar like that for our Tomb of Annihilation campaign, is give players a reason for actually traveling this far, an 8-week journey, instead of just a, hey, it's a good paying gig, which maybe that's enough for some player characters. The Janissar being the only really lore-based faction we get here, which are kind of just like traveling nomadic good guys in a way, which the players could cross paths with. Oddly, because the players are kind of unknowingly working for the bad guys, it could create some interesting hostilities there, but they don't really, unfortunately, crop up in the story itself that much. The main quest is basically this: you're already, you've been hired to bring this MacGuffin to this person, right? So you take this 8-week journey across the sea to Calimport. You go from Calimport out into the Calim Desert, and then in the desert you get to Erishka's camp, and that's the person you have to turn the thing into. All right, that's all main quest beats. There's been nothing really along the way other than random encounters. And now when you turn it in, she rewards you, and then she tells you, okay, I've got another quest for you. Go to this dungeon, basically, and use this artifact to actually gain entrance and bring me the items that you find in the temple, and I'll pay you even more money. And so the players are still maybe not even realizing, either naively or for whatever, or maybe they just like, okay, yeah, we'll do a freaking dungeon finally, something to do. But maybe they don't know if they're actually, working for the bad guys, and the fact that they're retrieving all these things is probably bad news. They should understand by the end of this dungeon, but it gets a little weird, and I wonder how much the storyline splits in terms of, are they actually working for the bad guys legitimately, or are they trying to like collect all the bad things so that they can destroy them? Maybe it gets more interesting from there. I will say that finally this dungeon crawl is pretty solid. It's very large. The designer does an interesting thing where they break it up into pages. We don't get a separate image of them, but we do get full color dungeon battle map. So it's kind of it's not a wash. It's better. I do appreciate that the designer built these maps in here, but we never get a big full overview picture of the entire dungeon. It's all just these little split apart maps, so it's kind of a little more challenging for me to have to flip back and forth and realize where all the dungeons are, and it makes it a little more confusing because of the way the dungeon is designed is kind of a 3-in-1 dungeon. You get to the beginning part, and then it eventually splits up into 3 ways, and you're supposed to basically complete all these 3 paths of dust, ice, and smoke, I believe, different like elements that are associated with air. And then you put all their 3 stones in the final area, and that unlocks the final room. And it's a pretty solid balance of, there's plenty of combat here. The very end, there's like mummies and air elementals, and I think an ice method at one point, this undead librarian. And there's a good mix of traps and hazards. One of the areas is basically a big like illusory labyrinth you have to make your way through, and everything's all fake, and there's monsters roaming around. It seems particularly very, very cool. So I appreciate a very large dungeon. It's odd that the designer, because normally I would say, oh, it's a big 15-20 room dungeon or something, and I'm not actually sure, because the designer does a weird thing where each leg of the journey is a secondary letter. So it's 5A, 5B, 5C, 5D. I guess I can see the way of organizing that, because each one is its own separate wing of the dungeon that you kind of have to complete and get the thing in to complete the other one. But the dungeon's bigger than it looks looking at one of these pictures, because it looks like these are all very small, but each one of these legs is 5, 6, 7 rooms long, and then all of that plus the beginning area and the final vault of air, where they basically come across a mummy lord whom they not designed to fight. The mummy lord just says, oh good, we're going to bring back my master, and here's the other half you need, and then you'll need to get the other half from the fire lord dungeon, and then you can free the genies. And at that point, and the players aren't really given a place to like chat or anything, so I guess I don't know what they're supposed to do from there. They can go back to the original person and be like, oh, but there's no information about the conclusion in terms of like, we want to turn on you and fight you, but I guess we're still working for you. You can go to the Janissar, I guess, and be like, hey, we need to get rid of these, but the plot says it kind of stays the same, because they just suggest, well, we can only destroy these in a certain place, so might as well go get the other one, and then we can destroy them together. It's a weird case of you want to try to make this cool twist of having your players work for the bad guys first, but it doesn't seem like there's a good enough payoff there, and I feel like the story still kind of ends up being mostly the same. There is a single side quest here, which is at the end, and it's actually kind of interesting. A bunch of Myconids are trying to create a new strain of themselves that can survive the desert heat, because there's this whole backstory about how the desert used to not be a desert. It was created that way because of the big Genie battles and war between these 2 giant factions. And you can actually talk to the Myconids about maybe you shouldn't be, killing people and using them as fertilizer to make your special desert mushrooms. Maybe we can come up with another plan, or you can just fight them all. But at least that's something. At least that's some content. I did skim through part 2, and it did feel a little more interesting, at least. At some point, you actually go to the city of Brass, which seemed pretty cool, in the Plane of Fire. The side quest felt a lot more interesting. There's the Great Conflagration, which is this meeting point of all the different planar realms that are adjacent to each other. So it kind of starts off a little bit running. It doesn't have quite the same issues as part one, but still has some of them, like the encounter tables, the lack of level progression, all that. So I do really enjoy the setting here. But I was disappointed because initially I thought, okay, we're basically kind of doing maybe Princes of the Apocalypse, but within a different setting. And I'm hoping, all right, maybe we can do better about creating more interesting factions and, characters and villains that pop up more often and still flesh out like the new setting, just like the Dasaran Valley works. And really none of that is here. So it was mostly disappointment, but I will say, the final dungeon crawl that's here is very big, very meaty, and maybe is worth the price of admission alone, but I would be hesitant just because of the way the map art is designed to be a little bit tricky to use in something like a virtual tabletop, because it's all chopped up and embedded here in the actual DM's Guild product. All right, let's go over my pros and cons for Rise of the Genie Lords Part 1. Pros, it refreshingly doesn't take place anywhere near the Sword Coast. Honestly, if you want me to sit up and take notice of your adventure at this point, having it take place outside the Sword Coast is a good start, because that has been mined to death, and I appreciate especially getting a desert-themed adventure, because we've already got our ice-themed adventure in Rime of the Frostmaiden, we've got our jungle-themed adventure in Tomb of Annihilation. We really could use a fun desert-themed campaign, so I really like the designer's ideas here, and obviously I think tying it to the concept of genies, which already has a lot of lore and interesting, multi-faction things built into it, is an awesome idea. So I think all the initial setting is really, really intriguing. And pro, the Temple of Akade is a big 3-in-1 dungeon crawl with a solid balance of combat traps and puzzles, and full-color battle maps, with the caveat that I wish these were separate image files that were also included. But I think it's a very solid dungeon crawl, and I'm thankful we have it here, because otherwise it's a lot of cons, unfortunately. First con is that a quarter of the adventure, this is about a 40-page, the total thing is, 40 and some change, but about the total adventure length is 40 pages, and 10 of those pages are dedicated to Calimport, where there's just nothing of interest going on for most DMs, and I would assume most players, unless you enjoy just random shopping episodes. Very disappointing. Con, potentially interesting travel excursions, such as the Luskan to Calimport 8-week ship travel, or traveling into the Calim Desert, are basically reduced to just random encounter tables and saves for diseases. So I was really expecting more. Some scripted content. If you ever have a choice that you want to between quantity and quality for your encounters, I would take quality every dang time. And most people, unfortunately, go the opposite direction. They feel like, oh man, we need to put like this whole big encounter table, all these different things. You don't have to do that. Just give me, honestly, reduce, instead of 20 random encounters, give me like 3 but well scripted, interesting stuff that involves, maybe some NPCs or some other hazards or some cool stuff that can still. The whole point of the random encounter is to give me just a reflection of the world and how dangerous it is, as well as maybe to drain the party's resources depending on how your resting rules are working. And I don't think that just random ass encounters on a table are necessarily going to do the first one, at least. And the other con is that there are no level progression from what I see, which is super bizarre and almost feels like just a really weird oversight on the designer's part to not include that, because that needs to be like the first thing that I'm looking for, is what level is this designed for? What levels are we supposed to reach at each major story point in the adventure? And then where are we supposed to be at the end of that one? And then thus, obviously, for the case of this one, which is a 5-part series, you can include that for each one of these. I was picturing this as being constructed kind of like a Pathfinder adventure path, which is really very similar to this in terms of they're pretty meaty. Each one is, maybe 50, 60, 70 pages. And then they'll be specifically, hey, you start at this level, you'll level up here, and then by the end, you're this level. In the next adventure, you obviously at that level, and then you go from there, and it includes the level breakdown for each of the major sections or chapters, which this also, I don't think even has chapters involved, just has the different areas. So that was very, very weird to look at an adventure that just doesn't do level progression at all and feels like a very odd oversight. Final verdict, part 1 of Rise of the Genie Lords smartly uses an underused corner of the Forgotten Realms. Huge cities, dangerous deserts, ancient ruins, all that is great, but it focuses too much on world building rather than creating a compelling narrative or interesting characters. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can watch more reviews and follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel, and you can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. Shouts to platinum patrons Joe, Will, Thomas, Adam, Stan, William, I'm Loud, Kyle, Brandon, Genocider, David, Eclectic, Roleplayer, Roll, Lindsay, and Christopher. And gold patrons RPG, Papercrafts, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Marcus, Dead Lizard, Lounge, Sam, Lumpy Spuds, Jerome, Nathan, Fast Like a Tortoise, and Scott. Thank you all very much for your support.